Hey everybody, welcome back to your favorite animation dissection named podcast called Animation Dissection. I am Neeksy, or other words, Neeksbert, with Zorak Bert.
Yep, and with our soundtrack by Danny Elfman.
So if you have not figured this out, today's episode is going to be about Dilbert, the animated series. Before we get started, quick fact, fun fact, did you know that Scott Adams is actually a colony of slime molds that kind of forms a sort of gestalt approximation of human intelligence?
I didn't know that, but, I always kind of suspected it, because it makes a lot of sense. What do you think about
looking at his blog, I look at that and I go, there's no way a collection of human neurons could come up with that. So it was the only other logical conclusion I could come up with.
Yeah. So Dilbert, the cartoon, is much better than Dilbert, the comic. It almost has very little to actually do with it other than the basic framework and some character concepts. But as an entity, it is vastly divorced from the comic that it originated from.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating that way. So, let me just go through the really quick run through the basics. So, Dilbert lasted 2 seasons for 30 episodes. It was broadcast originally around 1999 through 2000. So, right at the millennium turn on UPN. And it was produced by Larry Charles with Scott Adams, but I really credit most of what the series does well to Larry Charles. So also really quick background on Larry Charles. He had written on Seinfeld. I think he's worked on Curb Your Enthusiasm. He was kind of known for writing a lot of the more twisted and dark episodes of those types of shows. So I think a lot of what made this show good is it's him.
It's also what makes this show very much just say, hey, we made a more cartoony engineer Seinfeld.
Kind of. I think it surpasses Seinfeld in certain areas. In that not all of the characters are awful. So one of the things I really kind of like about one of the things I like about the Dilbert TV series is that the main character actually has a personality. I used to read the comics a little bit back when I was in high school, so I kind of have an understanding of it, where this version of him is he's idealistic and kind of actually has some kind of conscience, which is actually kind of nice to see. And I think it creates a lot of the really great thematic content in the episodes. A lot of the I guess I'd call it philosophical content that really defines what this show does, as opposed to, I think, what a lot of other shows have done. So he's not completely hateable. I mean, when I look at Seinfeld, for example, the whole point of that show is that everybody in that show is an asshole. There's no redeeming features of the main cast. Although I think there are definitely similarities between them. So when I look at the main ensemble of Dilbert, Wally, Alice, and I think the boss has a very Seinfeld-esque feeling to it. But Dilbert works better as being kind of like a protagonist that you kind of hope for. You root for as opposed to against.
Do you really, though? Because at the same time, he is also very deliberately, he is a moron in very selective ways. And, the world of Dilbert...
Yes, but that makes some flaws. I mean, it's a flaw, but it doesn't...
It's not a realistic flaw, because... The world of Dilbert is...
But he's not irredeemable.
Sure, but...
Oh, yeah, the world of Dilbert is a cynical... recreation of the Peter principle at large.
Right.
Otherwise known as people are promoted to their level of incompetence. I think a lot of it is very kind of fittingly harsh about both the business world as well as capitalism and a lot of society and culture. I mean, just there's a lot of interesting thoughts going on in this show that actually kind of worth examining. But in general, I feel that he's not completely unlikable. He has flaws, but he isn't this kind of in the comics. He's really ill-defined. He doesn't really have that kind of personality to him. He has a lot more of the author voice behind him in the comics, whereas in this one, he is sometimes proven right and sometimes proven wrong. He's never the voice of reason that is always right. I think Dogbert unfortunately ends up filling that role a lot of the time, although at least the show acknowledges that he's a sociopath as opposed to saying, hey, this guy's great.
Right.
Dogbert is the I guess I would say like the evil that succeeds in a world that in itself rewards evil. And I think the show actually does a pretty good job of demonstrating that. Whereas Dilbert he has certain levels of competences, but because of his idealism and his desire to kind of be inherently a good person, ends up becoming his big flaw in terms of living in that world and being successful in that world.
Not to mention,
he also has some other flaws.
Yes, because the other thing is that he's also a walking, talking engineer stereotype, and all the negative degrees that typically goes, and all the beneficial degrees that they typically go of like, he's so much more enlightened than everybody else, and it's kind of like, oh, give me a break, and they're very self-serious about it. I think about the quite timely, the one that they have there about the election system episode where they're engineering.
Oh, that was the final episode,
yes,
basically.
Yes, where he's developing it, and they're talking about like, yes, alter, you could do anything you want to, cheat on this other thing, and he's got his morality to it, but then he realized like, but everybody's actually a moron. It's kind of like, oh, very like,
yeah, there is that everybody's stupid but me kind of mentality in it, but at the same time, I think there's almost kind of something comforting about it in that everybody's stupid. Even the people that are supposed to be in charge and manipulating, they're also kind of treated as being slightly dumb or short-sighted as well. So it kind of hits everybody equally, because usually that kind of elitist viewpoint spares its targets, versus this one, it really just seems to find that the entire world and the entire system in general is worthy of ridicule in one way or the other.
Except for Dilbert himself, who is, Dilbert gets goofs for being like, he's so bad with women, but that's because he's too smart for them. It's a little too, and that's...
It does get a little bit like that. I think that is probably definitely a flaw, but luckily I think the show does not rely on too much of that. I think the show smartly does not do very many episodes or plot lines around him with romance, and I think it gets a lot better when it does, kind of like I think when it goes to his interpersonal issues or his philosophical issues coming up against things he's being asked to do, I think work really well. Some of the stuff where I think the stuff with his dad was pretty funny, and the complexes that came out of that.
Yep.
I think the one where he has to consider what the afterlife is was a really great episode in my mind. Just because it's just a neat little exploration. It does a lot of what Futurama was able to kind of do with the sci-fi genre. And instead of necessarily being as quirky, I think, as Futurama really is, this one has kind of a slightly more grounded feel, although it still, of course, has tons of pseudoscience. But I don't know. It just has something kind of interesting to it. I think that elevates it beyond a lot of the other animated sitcoms that were going on at the same time. There was kind of an intelligence to it that I find kind of interesting and fascinating, that it was on like a broadcast network. There's lots of references to literary characters and concepts that I was like, damn, that's not like the sixth grade reading level things that a lot of mainstream broadcast things are kind of required to be, done in.
Yeah. Definitely, like, it's compared to like shows of its time, the type that, it was surrounded of. It definitely had a more, a blacker humor than you really got of the ilk. Because, this Dilbert came out right when The Simpsons was making its turn, essentially.
Yeah, 1999. Everybody was doing their animated sitcoms around that time period. Family Guy was just starting out.
Was Futurama starting at that point, or did Futurama come later?
Futurama started a bit after Dilbert did, because the first episode takes place after the year 2000.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. They timed it that one. I think I think and Family Guy existed before.
Didn't it?
Yeah, I think Family Guy existed around the same time period as well.
I could have sworn Family Guy was later. Well, I'm going to look this up while we.
Well, well, I remember which broadcast of it, because when it was originally broadcast and then when it was brought back, and I think Family Guy started around 2000.
You're right. We had like 2 seasons or in 1999, and then after that, and then it vanished for
and that was around the same time when The Simpsons started going its way. But I mean, you also had things like The Critic, which I think there was like Family Dog. They tried to do this thing called Nervous Eric, there was just tons of these kind of forgettable animated sitcoms going on at the time. I mean, and even just regular sitcoms too. I think what this one was asking of its audience to kind of know and understand was unusual amongst them. I mean, again, they're bringing up certain philosophical concepts or even other concepts like causality when it does the episode about predicting the future and all sorts of things like that. So like it brings up a lot of neat subjects, but it never does it in a way that is incomprehensible. Like it doesn't talk down to you and that you're stupid for not getting it.
Sure.
So it does a pretty good job of that. I mean, I think if it was left up to Scott Adams himself, it would be terrible. But I think Larry Charles did a pretty good job of being able to relate this. I think in terms of the characters, I really liked how they bounced off of each other. That's a lot of really good character humor and verbal back and forths throughout this entire series. I think the main 4 characters at the office work really well. I ended up enjoying Wally quite a bit as this kind of, fall guy, lazy character. I think one of the best bits was how they kept on trading him sick days for stuff, even though they're not transferable and you can't accumulate them. They've been using him to steal office supplies for years.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the character dynamics are good, but I have to say, like, the origins of this, of like the main writer or series creator or whatever being in like the Seinfeld staff
bubble
really comes through in the sense that there is that kind of like the main characters aren't friends by any means. They're not really, but they're still connected together because through like kind of black threads, they're kind of stuck together.
They are dark passengers inside of each other's psyches.
Yeah, it's like they're all stuck together and they just cannot be removed from each other. They all seem to just be stuck, like kind of like anytime things happen.
Have that episode. They're like my family, my messed up, terrible family.
Exactly. They're all stuck together. They all really can't stand each other, but they also spend a lot of time together for some reason because they're all just so.
Well, they're at work. Well,
that too.
They're at work.
True, but even
they're on the same team all the time.
But even out of work, they seem to be. It's because when you get down to it, they're all just terrible people, and who else would want to hang out with them?
Yeah. Well, to be fair, with the way the show works, outside of that group, you're not going to find a lot of other great people either.
No. Sure. I mean that's one major difference between like this and Seinfeld is that Seinfeld is kind of the main cast happening to other people. And everybody there is eccentric in Seinfeld. You have the main cast that are, just assholes uniformly, but everybody else around them are also either, not that great, but they're at least weird.
They have a slight annoyance as opposed to, a full out psychological disorder.
Yeah, whereas in like Dilbert, everybody around them is essentially a moron or evil or something, except for, I don't know, like Dilbert's mom.
She has her own issues, I think, as well.
Sure.
I mean, the way she talks to her own child is kind of
sure. I'm not saying
in certain ways.
I'm not saying she's a great person, but she is at the very least has some grounding in. I'm stretching a little bit here.
Well, I mean, it's also one of the few characters I think that has a role like a mother. I mean, in general, like there's not a lot of female presence in this thing. But then again, I'm thinking, well, this is the business world and also engineering, which has had issues with both women and female recruitment. And I think the show did a couple really good bits about it. I think there's that one bit where all the executives are on the golf course. And they keep on trying to find ways to ditch the female CEO that's trying to join in with them. I thought that was a really good one. I think the episode overall about mergers and stock buybacks really holds up, especially now. It's one of those ones that I think did really well. They did a couple really good shots at a lot of the issues of feminism, which is, again, surprising considering the source material is, very anti-feminist in a lot of ways.
Sure.
I also don't think the show lasted long enough to get into too much into female things, but I like the way they handled Alice overall. It's one of those things where you could be feminist without holding women up to a pedestal as well. So they kind of let her be just as flawed as anyone else, but they also don't make her flawed because of her feminine traits or her status. So I think it did a really good job of making her a complete character that's allowed to be funny. I mean, a lot of female characters in these things are kind of just props, and they aren't really allowed to make jokes or do a lot of things. I mean, just even thinking about Warner Brothers characters, there's very few female characters in it, if any. So it was kind of refreshing to have her be a central character and, be allowed to have her personality as it is.
Absolutely.
And I also think Kathy Griffin did a really good job performing her. Overall, there's just really good voice acting in this.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Tom Kenny. There's so much Tom Kenny in this. I mean, I love him. It's really funny seeing how many characters in the background are him.
Yeah.
I mean, this show also has a lot of just that 90s animated sitcom casting. Maurice LaMarche. I can't remember. She plays Mom on Futurama.
Right.
I mean, these are all really talented people, but they're just so ubiquitous. Like, watch The Simpsons or Freakazoid or any of these things, and you're going to hear them in there. So it's kind of one of those weird things I started noticing doing these episodes in general, is how many shows had the kind of same revolving cast for the incidental voices in general. I can't remember who did the pointy-haired boss in this one, that voice actor, but
Larry Miller.
I really liked what he did. Like his line delivery was really good.
It was Larry Miller.
Like yes, good. God, he did a really good job with that. Like he was able to really elevate that character, I think, beyond what his original conception is. Like they didn't make him just dumb. You get these weird little insights into his background and the way he delivers his lines, his choices in how he emphasizes certain things, de-emphasize the speeding up and slowing down, the break. He did a really good job with that. And I think that really helps quite a bit in the performance. In terms of visuals, I was actually pretty impressed how well a lot of it held up despite not being in HD and being of its time period.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of the technology is very much like, the beige box computers and things like that. But visually, a lot of it held up. Like even the CG in the intro worked really well with the style. Like it didn't have too much of that distracting juxtaposition that you normally have when you do the CG combined with 2D. So that intro is damn.
Yes. The intro CG looks good. The actual CG that they occasionally use in the episodes is not nearly
so
as
much,
good.
no.
Yeah.
But luckily, they don't use it that much.
Right.
Like even cases where you might have actually chosen to use CG, they didn't. So like I think when the Gruntmaster starts tearing the fabric of time and space, they still did that with 2D, and it oddly worked pretty well. Whereas normally a lot of people would resort to doing CG for that.
I mean, I have to wonder how much of that is them lucking out by being too early for the really heavy CG push. Like they're right at that transition
or
point.
If it was an intentional smart choice.
I don't know. Like after a certain point, everybody got into it because like this is going to save us money, so you should do it. You need to.
And then neither turns out to be true.
Well, yeah,
it doesn't really save money in the end, nor does it look right.
No, but everybody believed it for a time, so I have to wonder if they were just
Zorak, people still believe that.
Yeah, I mean,
they try to use CG when it would actually have been better just to draw it.
I mean, it saves money in very narrow, specific circumstances related to reusing assets, and that's essentially it. Like, if you're
that's if you're reusing it as an asset. Sometimes they're using CG for ad hoc things, and I just go like,
which is like, why bother at that point? Yeah, or I guess maybe that might be a staffing thing also, where it's kind of like, well, everybody else is busy actually doing the drawing. Hey, CG guys, I need you to make me a truck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just looking at the art style in general, like it is such an elevation over its source material. It's kind of insane. Like the backgrounds are really well realized. I think it has a really nice color palette overall. It's this kind of subdued. It's not like super realistic or anything, but it is a very subdued palette that I think works really well. There's a really good sense of foreground, background. Everything's directed pretty well. Like they don't do a lot of the kind of Family Guy style shots where it's very stagey in a lot of ways, where it feels like, puppets on a Praskinian stage or something like that. They kind of treat it a little bit more cinematically, but without getting too much into that. It's just, I was kind of impressed by that when I look back at it. I mean, of course, it's still an animated sitcom in the 90s, so you're going to get all sorts of the errors, and you're going to get, a lot of the outsourcing that is done on it. You're going to just get that kind of overall style. No one's doing any really interesting things with animation timing or acting with this, but it still accomplishes quite a bit with that. And especially like, the types of scenes and events that happening, it's kind of impressive. Like, there's not a lot of stuff they could reuse. I mean, like certain action scenes and things like that.
Sure.
The other thing I noticed in the series when I'm thinking about that is how high the death count is. It's very grim. A lot of people die in every episode, often on screen.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of that seems to come from the fact that they're going for a more cartoony Seinfeld, and obviously in Seinfeld, given that it is an actors acting sitcom, and they have to maintain. Well, they want
that it's a grounded, it's a more grounded reality.
Sure. Whereas with this one, it's a cartoon. People are more willing to suspend their disbelief. We can murder people constantly. It doesn't actually matter that much, which is very true. They can in fact get away with that. Even the Simpsons has played around with that for a while there, where they would constantly.
But not as like directly and I think viciously as this show does. Like this show has a guy getting crushed by a parade float, and in the wreckage of his car before he dies, he goes, "It's so cold."
Yeah,
like that. That is. I mean, I found that just amazing, and it's shocking, and it works oddly well. But I'm just kind of almost begrudgingly impressed by how vicious it's able to be, in that regard. I think a lot of it can a little bit be attributed to, I think, excessive cynicism at times.
Sure.
I mean, watching too much of it in a row, it just makes you just, oh my God, the world's terrible.
I mean, that's actually one of the things I kind of, a little bit of a criticism I have for that. It has a fair bit of range in terms of the actual things it does in the episodes, and I appreciate the fact that they manage to have like overlying plot lines in a series that is kind of just very goof focused to a certain degree. Like even things like The Simpsons, which are aged, have had decades now. Jeez. Even they shy away from doing, like across a season, plot lines or anything like that. They've done like little, multi-episode things that count occasionally. It's like, who cares? And even
mostly out of desperation.
Sure. And, Futurama does that stuff occasionally, but we had actually, like very discrete, across the season plot lines, like the thing with like the Grunt Master 5000 or whatever. They had the plot line about the entire development history of that spanning the entire season, and that's kind of weird thing. But that being said, a lot of these episodes are also very samey because the kind of message that they have, it comes like, it's like, yeah, bosses sure are bad, this industry sure is rough, like they keep on like they don't have a whole wide range that they can actually go with, because they have the very narrow subject of this is a comic about engineering workplaces. We can only really riff on that. It's kind of the thing of like, yeah, it's almost as if like a newspaper comic on this would have gotten tired like 5 decades ago. Whereas it's been lasting way longer than it should have because nobody would ever watch it or read it exclusively throughout time. You would see it occasionally and be like, huh, that's a comic. That's mildly amusing.
That's why I think it's smart in that it chose to go outside of that.
Sure.
So again, like it will use the office setting as a way to examine other things. So it examines the concept of how we create our own families, how, again, the afterlife being like a cubicle with Wally. It explores a lot of these ideas that go outside of the office itself. I mean, it uses it as its maybe starting point and setting, but it goes beyond that. However, I do agree that there is a little bit of a formula going on where the episodes that aren't necessarily plot centric, I mean, or whatever stands for a overarching plot,
right.
Is that it's kind of like a King of the Hill-esque, here is main character up against antagonist that represents a philosophical concept of some sort. So like, and it kind of plays out in the same way, and then in the end, it works with a conclusion.
Sure,
usually summed up by Dogbert, explaining what just happened and what it meant and things like that. So those get a little bit samey. So you have like the art world one, the Blue Duck, or CompuComp, or a couple of other ones that are kind of standalone, where it's let's explore this one area of human life and see how it goes. I think maybe the one about like where he accidentally knocks off all of telecommunications and people turn into this like agrarian society within like 12 hours, and then immediately go back to normal, going like, oh man, I missed my stuff. So like things like that. It has a lot of that resolution. Yeah, I mean, each episode really kind of has a little bit of a by the numbers approach to kind of addressing things. I think some of the worst ones though are like, I think the baseball one is not very good, where it's the Romeo and Juliet thing.
Oh, yep.
That one wasn't very good. It also did the ending didn't really make any sense.
Nope.
But yeah, I liked some of the stuff about Albonia. That was interesting. They brought in some really good Kissinger burns on how awful he was.
Yeah.
It was
that's
kind of
the weird thing about this, actually, to get a bit meta for a second, like the sense that Dilbert's creator, Scott Adams, is a very much in the right wing. And it's very funny looking at this, given the fact that, I'm willing to bet that Larry Charles is definitely in the not.
I kind of feel, I mean, he is probably the closest I could think of would be like, it feels like he's one of those people that would be like an anarcho-syndicalist or something like that.
Sure.
Like, maybe just anarchist of some sort. but not in the U.S. understanding of anarchy. I'm thinking more like European-style anarchy. But
sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird seeing that as the contrast. I mean, the critiques on capitalism, and I think a lot of the business class was really interesting. Again, that episode where Dilbert and Wally buy and sell the shares and the various manipulations like that is really timely, and that episode itself I think holds up really well, especially with just looking at stock buybacks and various artificially inflating of stock prices that has just become even more so during the Silicon Valley boom.
Sure. And I mean, and a lot of the stuff they talk about in general about, like engineering, the process and like, work, it's like the whole ethics, argument that they have with the episode about the ethics stuff. Like, as someone who works in an engineering workplace, like that stuff still, holds up conceptually. Like, they're goofing on that type of stuff. They ain't wrong, about, and there's certain stuff that is, supercharged in ways that I would disagree with because, I don't necessarily agree with the wholehearted, loathing that Scott Adams has in here for management, because I've definitely seen plenty of engineers, be themselves, wholly unethical and just lazy jerks and shit. And
that's why I think it's actually even-handed, because then look at characters like Wally.
Sure.
Look at the various.
Yeah,
I mean, so I think the show is oddly fair in that it treats a lot of it treats the management as being either idiots or just self-interested and evil, but then you also look at the various employees that will also be just as exploitative when given the chance. I mean, I think the show, I think that's a little bit of a negative view, but at least it's kind of fair. It's oddly balanced in its disdain for humanity. in a lot of ways. So which again is it's not great, but at least it's not, I guess, unbalanced.
Sure.
Question mark. So I mean, yeah. Overall, I've really, I don't think the show is perfect by any means. I think it does a little bit of straw manning in certain areas, but then again, it's a cartoon show made for entertainment value, not necessarily to make good arguments. I think it does a way better job of it than I think South Park does when it comes to talking about various social and political issues. Oddly. Again, despite its source material and its original author, it somehow is able to do that. Were there any specific episodes that kind of stuck out to you as being particularly interesting or bad in any case?
I don't know if it's necessarily particularly interesting, but an episode that's always stuck in my mind over the years for I have no idea what reason. Like I saw this episode as a kid, and for some reason it lodged itself in my mind. Is the mall episode with
the one with his dad?
Yeah, for some reason that's stuck in. For some reason that is eternally stuck in my head with the all you can eat, and he's just literally just living at this all you can eat because. It's that
all you can eat. It's the principle of the thing. The flinging people off of the escalators was for some reason a really funny bit to me.
Right.
Or the language that is entirely made up of various store names.
Yeah. There's just a lot of creative concepts that were kind of, it felt like they're like, what is the most negative stuff we can do about the mall? It's kind of like, what do we got, guys? What do we got? What mall gag? It's like nothing's too.
Well, what's really weird though is thinking about it in the mall, and I think of like that concept doesn't necessarily hold up as well now.
No,
just because malls have really, I mean, unless it's like a certain type of upscale mall, they've really just disappeared. I mean, that in certain areas the show has not aged well, but in other cases it holds up. Like, again, there's a whole episode about the Y2K bug. I mean,
sure.
it's of its time, especially when he's ordering this supercomputer online, and that was like the first start of things like Amazon and people starting to come to grips with the fact that like you're not really going to be interacting with human beings in a lot of ways. Like the astonishment that the characters have, it's like you're using a computer to buy a computer. What?
Yeah.
Like they're pretending that that's somehow weird, and we're just so used to it. So certain things like that don't necessarily age too well. But I can't think of a lot of shows that directly have addressed the internet back then. Have been able to do so.
I mean, honestly, the closest that really is, again, and this is slightly a few years later, it's like Futurama did some good stuff with its depiction of, the VR version of the internet.
Oh yes, with the pop-up ads and everything.
Yeah, it's like that's a little outdated in the sense that
well, chat rooms being
but they managed to obfuscate it enough through enough weirdness in terms of like where you can kind of like I could see that coming back, or I could see that being, holding up. Like there's nothing really that doesn't hold up in the general sense in their internet episode in Futurama,
Yeah. Well, I think stuff that holds up is when they aren't using those details as the focus of what's necessarily going on. It's when they're using it as a way to examine other human traits. So like when there's something inherently, observationally human about what they're doing, that will hold up a lot longer. So like even though the details of like what the computers look like or certain ways in which we interact with technology, as long as I think they make basic observations about how people are, or just, or at least just good gags, that stuff is able to survive, I think, the test of time.
Sure.
So we'll just have to see. Other than that, I really don't have too much else to say. I mean, I kind of was surprised coming back into watching it how good it really was. If we want to play the game of why was this canceled, I think being on UPN was a big reason. I don't know if this show really would have been able to last too long. Like certain shows, they are better having lasted only like 2 or 3 seasons.
I mean,
I think this show could have done maybe a couple more seasons and still be good. but I don't know if it would have necessarily had the lasting power. Like, I think the critique of the characters being, who they are would make it kind of difficult to keep going with them for too long.
Sure. And I don't think it's, obviously the stations and networks producing these shows want, there to be a new Futurama or no, new Simpsons, because that is, that's what gets the numbers. If you have a repeatable, you can, syndicate it, and that's a great thing for them. But, I'm obviously of the philosophy that there's nothing wrong with a series being relatively short and, having its time, doing what it can within that time, and then ending. And I think Dilbert would have struggled as a TV series going much longer than it has without going into weird directions. And maybe those weird directions would have been good. Maybe they could have found some really interesting ideas with their writing staff or something. Or it could have been really bad where they're just, digging real deep.
Let's introduce a love interest character, like that kind of thing, where it would have just... That would have been a bad turn.
Well, they could go that direction, or they could have gone the Simpsons direction, where it's like, we're going to remove all the gags, really, and make it kind of samey, and repeat the same exact thing ad infinitum for, as many seasons as we can manage, and just, kind of just
or just try to over define or overwrite their background characters that. They're fine being one note. Like, that's their purpose. Like, I don't want to know the deep, dark backstory of Loud Howard or anything like that.
I like how you were saying you're talking about the background characters, and I mean, I think it's like he's gonna talk about Loud Howard, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, luckily they didn't use him that much. Like he was blessedly not present at all times.
He's a good cheap joke, and you know what? That's fine. It's good to have cheap jokes that you can just wheel out occasionally.
Exactly.
It's like
you have to. They knew how to pace themselves, and I thought that was that restraint was very nice to see.
Yes,
I think they did a lot of really neat stuff with Ashok the intern as well.
Yes.
The episode about holidays gave him a little bit of touching of depth, but not enough that it became like overbearing or anything like that. I thought that was a kind of like a nice little moment. But then they also have him like, he has to eat the kitchen sponge because it's absorbed a little bit of the food. Just like how terrible the life is for interns. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty good one.
And the cultural stuff involving Ashok wasn't too awful. In the sense that they didn't go...
Well, they didn't draw too much attention to it, luckily.
Yeah.
Like, they mentioned that he has family back home, and that's about as much as they went. And they didn't give him, like, a really crazy accent either. I mean, it's just Tom Kenny with a slight accent.
Yeah, like, thankfully, they didn't go, like, horrendously racist with it or anything, so...
Yeah, again, that was kind of one of those surprising restraint things. The same thing with the female characters. They was like, wow, they were actually pretty restrained with what I was expecting, worse in how that stuff was going to be handled. I think there's also just really good observations of just personality types. Like, I think Dilbert's neighbors, the rich couple that has like the elephant and the all that random shit that they've got from like abroad, that kind of imperialism thing going on. I thought that appropriation, the bouginess of it all, I thought was a really great observation of a personality type. I don't know. There's a bunch of really great little things in there that you can kind of pick out as being just like well observed or just thoughtful. I liked the one about art was really good. I think the parody of the art critique nun was pretty good. Her constant refrain of her interpretations of the art being projections of her own I think sexuality, as well as her regrets at becoming a nun, was a pretty funny character observation or just a gag that they kept running pretty well.
Yep.
Plus the art world really is kind of fucked up.
So I guess that's all we got to say about Dilbert.
Yeah, like I'm not. It's one of those shows that it has a lot, but also not enough to really go too deep into.
Yeah, like I said, like it doesn't have like the range where like
it doesn't have the emotional range that The Simpsons at its best had.
Sure, and then there's not so many there's not so many outstanding episodes like, oh god, you remember this episode, you remember this episode, you remember this episode, where like The Simpsons for a while there, we're knocking them down, continually for seasons on end. It's just like, oh man, they were fucking killing it. Futurama had also where just like, man, they were just murdering it, where you could spend time on a single episode of those shows and just talk about that episode in detail, just because there's so much going on that is good writing, animation, such going on. Whereas with this, it's pretty consistent. It's not bad. It's not like astounding, but it's pretty, it's a steady low B, high C, I would say. That range.
I'm a little bit more generous. I think it is maybe a B range for me. I still think it was doing something a little bit different than other things. I agree that it wasn't as dense in terms of theme and characters. I think it definitely does not have the emotional poignancy that, again, the best Futurama or Simpsons was able to achieve. There's no touching moments or anything.
Oh yeah, because they have no heart at all, as it turns out.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like the anti-Simpsons in that regard. But I think in some of the topics it was touching, and its point of view were interesting. I mean, I'm not necessarily that I agree with them, but they were interesting points of view. Like, I think some of the Elbonian episodes about third world adventurism were pretty interesting points that I didn't see or haven't seen other shows attempt.
Sure.
In that regard. So it gets points for doing things in a philosophical way that I don't know. It's kind of like it's unburdened by a certain level of saccharine emotionality that is both an asset and a damaging point to it. So it's kind of odd in that regard. So I think overall I'm a little bit more. I liked it, I think, a little bit more than you did, but I definitely agree it has quite a few flaws, and most likely I think it would have only been able to eke out a couple, maybe one or two more decent seasons, before it would have, I think, collapsed upon itself, and the tone might have just become too unbearably dark after that. I mean, it's one of those shows, again, trying to watch a whole bunch of episodes in a row, you just go like, oh man, I just feel sick. I don't feel good about humanity at all.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is a little bit like that for me too. When I think about it, like, I love that show. I just, I can't watch a whole bunch of episodes of it in a row just because the sheer, antipathy to human existence just gets a little bit much after a bit.
And it's kind of interesting looking at like that, those kind of shows where the sense like you can feel that they're very deliberately trying to say something about the human experience, where it's kind of like, yeah, they actually they're saying this not just because it's a goof, but they kind of also mean it. Whereas like looking back at Seinfeld, like watching an episode of Seinfeld, I never came out of that going like, man, I feel worse for humanity for seeing Seinfeld, because Seinfeld is abstracted away for some reason, where you don't have a feel for there actually being a lot of actual bite to it.
Well, there's no thematic ideology to Seinfeld. It was a lot of the stuff that the characters were assholes. Well, yeah, they were bad people, but it was in superficial ways. Like, it wasn't a fundamental critique on like, hey, capitalism is inherently inhuman and trying to reduce, people to formulas, and people are, inherently superficial. Like, they won't like something because it's not cute anymore, et cetera. With I think Dilbert or various other shows that have that acerbic viewpoint, there is a undercurrent of kind of anger to it, but it's anger that's directed at a system it wants to take down. So it's like there's kind of like two forms of satire. There is Horatian and Juvenalian. Mm-hmm. I always mix up which one's which, and I think Horatian is when it is very pointed and very poisonous in a lot of ways, like where it is very much like, this is really fucked up, and I'm satirizing it to point out and take it apart and go like, hey, this is funny, but it's still kind of fucked up. And then Juvenalian is a bit more of a farcical style. Forgive me if I've mixed up the two, but it's one or the other in this case. But I think those are the basic definitions of those. And I think in this case, it has that Horatian view. Like it is, a comedy, but that humor and that kind of dark viewpoint is formed not out of, I would say, maybe empty cynicism, but a kind of well-earned cynicism, having experienced the absurdities of human society.
Sure.
So that might be what that kind of undercurrent feeling is coming from with shows like this and Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Like there's a darkness, but it's not empty. It's like a pool of black sludge. It's not just, the absence of light.
Sure.
So there you go. That was Dilbert. So after this, next time we will be talking about Disney's Moana, which I think just came out this weekend, I can't remember. Disney has not been advertising it that much for some reason. But after that, we will be doing Legend of the Galactic Heroes. We're giving you guys advanced notice because this is a very long series to watch. So
I will real quick say about that. So Legend of the Galactic Heroes, you can't buy it. I wish you could. There's weird licensing stuff about that. Look online. I believe you can find it on YouTube as well as via torrenting on sites such as Baka BT. The watch order for it that I generally recommend there are 2 movies at the start of it. My Conquest is the Sea of the Stars is a standalone movie that they made first before they made the show. And then they made, I believe it's Overture to a New War, which replaced the first 2 episodes of the television series. And then it's episodes 3 through 110, sorry. But
I was about to internally scream. It was 210.
110. And I will point out that this is, you volunteered to do this. I didn't even get you. This is my favorite anime of all time, and I just posted a screenshot of it in relation and in response to things about our most recent U.S. election. And you're like, oh, we should do this one next. And it's kind of just, the funny thing was that when you...
Well, to be fair, it's also because it is one of your favorite ones of all time. So I'm like, you know what? I am going to... Hey, you know what? If I find out it sucks, I can judge you forever.
Sure, but
why would I not take that opportunity?
Sure, but I will also point out that when you did that, everybody that I was hanging out with who have never seen that series before but knew enough from talking to me immediately started laughing because they knew what you had signed yourself up for in terms of the pure runtime.
Yeah. Hey, I watched Rosa Versailles 2 times through. Okay.
Yes, but this is longer than that by far.
So going back to the viewing order, the 2 movies, and then start at episode 3 and then on.
Yes, or alternatively, for some of the other people out there where you just want to know what the heck it's about, there are novel versions of it because it originally was a series of novels, and those novels are purchasable in paper. You can buy them on Amazon.
Awesome.
Yep.
So again, Legend of the Galactic Heroes will be after Moana.
Yep.
So, all right. So we will see you guys next time.